The Night Weaver, by Marlowe. Chapter 1, The Vanishing Thread. The city of Blackthorn was no stranger to whispers of the macabre. Its cobblestone streets, perpetually shrouded in mist, carried the echoes of old legends, passed down like heirlooms in shadowed corners of taverns and firelit homes. But this time, the whispers were different. This time, they weren't speaking of ghosts or curses, they were speaking of the Night Weaver. Detective Elias Thorne sat in his cramped office at the Blackthorn Police Department, staring at a growing stack of missing persons reports. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the cluttered desk. Each file told a similar story. A person vanishes without a trace, leaving behind no signs of struggle, no witnesses, and no leads. The cases were scattered across the city, yet they seemed to follow an invisible thread that Elias couldn't quite grasp. "Another one came in this morning," said his partner, Detective Julia Haynes, as she entered the room. She dropped a thin folder onto his desk. "That's the third this week." Elias rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling in like an old friend. "Any witnesses?" "None. Just like the others. But there's something else." Julia hesitated, her usual confidence faltering. This time, the victim left something behind. Elias sat up straighter. "What is it?" Julia pulled a small evidence bag from her coat pocket. Inside was a scrap of fabric, intricately woven with dark, almost iridescent threads. It shimmered faintly under the light, as though it had a life of its own. "They found this on the victim's bed," Julia explained. "The forensic team said it doesn't match any known material. It's not from around here." Elias studied the fabric, his mind racing. The weave was complex, almost hypnotic, and the pattern seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. It was unsettling, yet oddly mesmerizing. "Where was this found?" he asked. "On Silverpine Lane," Julia replied. "Same area as the first disappearance." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. Silverpine Lane was a quiet, unassuming street lined with old Victorian houses. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences, not the kind of place where people vanished into thin air. "I'll take a look," he said, rising from his chair. "You coming?" Julia hesitated. "I have to follow up on another lead." "But be careful, Elias. Something about this case feels wrong." He nodded, grabbing his coat and the evidence bag. As he stepped out into the night, the cold air bit at his skin. The city seemed quieter than usual, as if it, too, was holding its breath. Silverpine Lane was cloaked in an eerie stillness. The gas lamps lining the street cast long, flickering shadows across the cracked pavement. Elias parked his car near the victim's house, a modest two-story home with a weathered facade. The curtains in the windows were drawn, and the front door was marked with police tape. Inside, the house was just as quiet. Elias moved carefully through the rooms, his flashlight illuminating the corners where the shadows lingered. The bedroom was the last stop. It was here that the fabric had been found, lying neatly on the bed as though placed there deliberately. Elias stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the empty bed. The room was untouched, yet it felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning for any clues. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something metallic. As he leaned over the bed, a faint sound reached his ears. It was almost imperceptible, like the rustling of fabric in the wind. He turned sharply, but the room was empty. The sound persisted, growing louder, until it became a low, rhythmic hum. Elias's flashlight flickered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He gripped the handle of his gun, his pulse quickening. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. The hum stopped abruptly. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Elias saw something move, a shadow darting across the wall, quick and fluid like a ripple in water. He turned the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. Only the faint shimmer of the fabric on the bed, glowing softly in the darkness. Elias approached the bed again, his instincts screaming at him to leave. He picked up the fabric, holding it under the flashlight. The threads seemed to pulse, almost as if they were alive. His vision blurred for a moment, and he felt a strange tugging sensation in his chest, as though the fabric was pulling at something deep inside him. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, soft and melodic but tinged with an otherworldly edge. "You shouldn't have touched that." Elias spun around, his gun drawn. Standing in the doorway was a figure cloaked in darkness. Their features were obscured, but their presence was undeniable. The air around them seemed to warp and twist, as if reality itself was bending to accommodate them. "Who are you?" Elias demanded. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they raised a hand, and the fabric in Elias's grip began to unravel, the threads pulling away like strands of smoke. The room filled with a blinding light, and then nothing. Elias woke up on the floor, his head pounding. The fabric was gone, and so was the figure. The room was silent once more, but the sense of unease lingered, heavier than before. He stumbled to his feet, his mind racing. Whatever he had just encountered, it wasn't human. And it was connected to the Night Weaver. Elias left the house, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. As he drove back to the station, the city seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The case was no longer just about missing people, it was about something much larger, something that defied logic and reason, and Elias was now a part of it, whether he liked it or not. Chapter 2: Threads of Fear. Elias Thorne sat in his car outside the Blackthorn Police Department, gripping the steering wheel as the events of the night played over in his mind. The figure, the fabric, the voice, they felt more like fragments of a nightmare than reality. Yet the ache in his head and the gnawing unease in his gut were stark reminders that it had been real. Whatever he had encountered at the house on Silver Pine Lane wasn't natural, and it wasn't finished with him. He glanced at the evidence bag on the passenger seat. It was empty now, the mysterious fabric gone without a trace. Elias had no idea how to explain this, let alone where to begin looking for answers. He needed clarity, and for that, he needed Julia. Inside the station, the hum of activity was muted, as though the building itself shared the weight of the city's unease. Julia was seated at her desk, typing furiously on her computer. She looked up as Elias approached, her sharp eyes narrowing when she saw his expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, leaning back in her chair. "What happened?" Elias hesitated, debating how much to tell her. The house was strange. Something was off about it. And the fabric, it's gone. Julia frowned. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "I mean it disappeared," Elias said, lowering his voice. "Right in front of me. And there was someone there, Julia. Someone or something. They weren't human." She stared at him, her disbelief evident. "Elias, are you sure you're not just tired? You've been running yourself into the ground with this case." "I know what I saw," he said firmly. "This isn't just about missing people anymore. There's something else going on, something we don't understand." Julia sighed, rubbing her temples. "Okay, let's say you're right. Where do we even start? We don't have the fabric, and if you're saying there was no physical evidence left behind, there was one thing," Elias interrupted. "A voice. They said, you shouldn't have touched that." Julia's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her reaction. That's cryptic. Did they say anything else? Give any clue about who they are? No. But the way they appeared, the way the fabric disappeared, it all felt connected. Like they're weaving something, Julia. And we're caught in the threads. The metaphor hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. After a long silence, Julia nodded. Let's look at the files again. Maybe there's a connection we've missed. For the next several hours, they pored over the missing persons reports. The victims had little in common, different ages, backgrounds, and professions. But as they dug deeper, Elias noticed a subtle pattern. Look at this, he said, pointing to a map spread across the table. He had marked the locations of the disappearances with red pins. They form a spiral. Julia leaned closer, her brow furrowed. A spiral? That's strange. Do you think it's intentional? Nothing about this feels random, Elias said. The question is, what's at the center of the spiral? They followed the trajectory of the pins, tracing the pattern inward. It led to an abandoned textile factory on the outskirts of the city, Merrick Mills. The factory had been closed for decades, a relic of Blackthorn's industrial past, of course, Julia muttered. If you're weaving threads, where better to start than a textile factory? Elias gave her a pointed look. We need to check it out. Tonight? Yes. The longer we wait, the more people disappear. Julia sighed but grabbed her coat. Fine. But if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. Backup, flashlights, and no running headfirst into danger. Agreed, Elias said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Merrick Mills loomed in the distance like a sleeping giant, its broken windows and crumbling walls silhouetted against the dim glow of the moon. The air here was colder, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel underfoot as Elias and Julia approached. Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it, Julia muttered, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Elias nodded, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The factory gates were rusted shut, but they managed to slip through a gap in the fence. Inside, the air smelled of damp concrete and mildew. The beams of their flashlights revealed rows of rusted machinery, long abandoned and overtaken by cobwebs. As they moved deeper into the factory, a faint sound reached their ears, a rhythmic tapping, like the steady beat of a metronome. Elias held up a hand, signaling Julia to stop. You hear that? He whispered. She nodded, her expression tense. They followed the sound, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. It led them to a large loom in the center of the factory floor. Unlike the other machinery, the loom looked pristine, its wooden frame polished and free of dust. Threads of dark, shimmering material were stretched across it, weaving themselves together in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Julia's jaw dropped. It's weaving itself. Elias stepped closer, his heart pounding. The threads were identical to the fabric from the evidence bag, their iridescent shimmer almost hypnotic. As he watched, the loom seemed to breathe, the threads moving as though guided by invisible hands. This is it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is where it's happening. Before Julia could respond, the air around them shifted. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, coalescing into a familiar figure. It was the same cloaked presence Elias had seen at Silverpine Lane, their form indistinct but undeniably menacing. You shouldn't have come here, the figure said, their voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. Julia drew her gun, her hand steady. Who are you? What are you doing to these people? The figure tilted their head, as if considering the question. I am the Night Weaver, they said. And you are in my web. The threads on the loom began to move faster, the rhythmic tapping growing louder. Elias felt the same tugging sensation in his chest, stronger this time, as though the threads were pulling at his very being. "Elias, we need to go," Julia said, her voice tight with fear, but Elias couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the loom, on the intricate patterns forming before him. Each thread seemed to carry a story, a memory, a life. And at the center of it all was the night weaver, orchestrating it with chilling precision. "Leave now," the figure said, "or be woven into the tapestry." Julia grabbed Elias's arm, breaking the trance. "Elias, now." They ran, the sound of the loom and the figure's laughter echoing behind them. As they burst out into the night, Elias felt the weight of what they had seen pressing down on him. The night weaver wasn't just taking people. They were weaving something far more sinister, and Elias had a sinking feeling that he was already entangled in their design. Chapter 3: The Tapestry of Shadows. Elias Thorne sat at his desk, staring at the tangle of notes and photographs spread before him. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind with startling clarity: the self-moving loom, the sinister figure, the threads shimmering with life. He clenched his fists, frustration mingling with fear. What was the night weaver? What were they weaving? And, most disturbingly, why did it feel like he was part of it? Julia entered his office, her face grim. She placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him and sank into the chair opposite. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. "I didn't," Elias replied, his voice hoarse. "How could I? That factory, the loom, it's like nothing I've ever seen before." Julia nodded. "I've been digging into Merrick Mill's history. Turns out, there's more to that place than meets the eye." She handed him a folder. Inside were old newspaper clippings and historical documents about the factory. One headline stood out: "Merrick Mill's owner and family found dead in mysterious circumstances." The article detailed the strange demise of Harold Merrick, the factory's founder, and his family in 1924. The coroner's report described them as drained of vitality, with expressions of sheer terror etched onto their faces. "Looks like the factory's been cursed from the start," Julia said. Harold Merrick was obsessed with creating the perfect weave. Some say he dabbled in the occult, trying to infuse his textiles with life. After his death, workers started reporting strange phenomena: machines operating on their own, whispers in the shadows. The place was shut down not long after. Elias leaned back, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to click together. And now it's happening again. The loom, the disappearances, it all ties back to Merrick Mills. But why? Julia asked. What's the connection to these missing people? Elias didn't have an answer. Yet deep down, he felt the truth was far darker than they could imagine. Later that afternoon, Elias decided to visit one of the missing persons' families. Jessica Harper, a 17-year-old high school student, had vanished 2 weeks ago. Her parents lived in a modest house on the edge of town, the porch lined with yellow ribbons. Mrs. Harper greeted Elias at the door, her eyes red from crying. "Detective Thorne," she said, her voice trembling. "Have you found her?" "We're working hard on the case, Mrs. Harper," Elias said gently. "I was hoping you could tell me more about Jessica. Did she mention anything unusual before she disappeared?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. The living room was filled with photographs of Jessica smiling at her school dance, laughing with friends, hugging her younger brother. "She was a good girl," Mrs. Harper said, her voice breaking. "But a few days before she went missing, she started acting strange. She'd stay up late, staring out the window. Said she felt like someone was watching her." "Did she say who?" Mrs. Harper shook her head. "No. But the night she disappeared, I found this on her bed." She handed Elias a piece of fabric. It was identical to the one he'd seen at Silverpine Lane and in the factory, dark, shimmering, almost alive. Where did she get this? Elias asked, his pulse quickening. I don't know, Mrs. Harper said. But I feel like it's connected to her disappearance. Please, detective, you have to find her. Elias promised he would and left the house, the fabric clutched tightly in his hand. That evening, Elias and Julia met at his apartment to discuss the new evidence. Jessica's mom gave me this, Elias said, placing the fabric on the table. Julia stared at it, her expression wary. It's the same as the one from the factory. Exactly. But how did Jessica get it? And why was she acting strange before she disappeared? Julia's eyes narrowed. What if the Night Weaver doesn't just take people? What if they mark them first? That fabric, it could be some kind of signal or lure. Elias nodded slowly. That would explain the disappearances. The victims are chosen, marked, and then taken. But why? Julia asked. What's the endgame? Elias didn't have an answer. The factory, the loom, the Night Weaver, they were all part of a larger design, one that he was only beginning to understand. That night, Elias found himself dreaming again. He was back in Merrick Mills, standing before the loom. The threads glimmered in the dim light, weaving themselves into intricate patterns. As he watched, faces began to appear in the fabric: Jessica Harper, Harold Merrick, the other missing persons. Their expressions were frozen in terror, their eyes pleading for help. You're in my web now, a voice whispered, low and cold. Elias turned to see the Night Weaver standing behind him, their cloaked figure towering over him. What do you want? He demanded. To complete the tapestry, the Night Weaver said. And you, detective, are the final thread. Elias jolted awake, his heart pounding. The words echoed in his mind, the final thread. Whatever the Night Weaver was planning, it wasn't just about the missing people. It was about him. The next day, Elias and Julia returned to the factory, determined to uncover the truth. The air was thick with tension as they stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The loom was still there, its threads moving with an almost hypnotic rhythm. But now, there was something new. A large tapestry hung behind it, partially complete. It depicted a swirling spiral, with faces woven into the fabric. Julia gasped. Those are the missing people. Elias stepped closer, his stomach twisting. It's a map, he realized. The spiral from the disappearances. It's all leading to this. Before Julia could respond, the shadows around them began to shift. The Night Weaver emerged, their presence overwhelming. You shouldn't have come back, they said, their voice resonating with power. Elias raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. What are you doing to these people? I am giving them purpose, the Night Weaver said. Their lives are threads in the grand design. And now, detective, so is yours. The threads on the loom shot out like tendrils, wrapping around Elias and Julia. They struggled, but the threads were unyielding, pulling them closer to the tapestry. Let us go. Julia shouted. You cannot escape the web, the Night Weaver said. You are part of it now. As the threads tightened, Elias realized that the only way to stop the Night Weaver was to destroy the loom. With a burst of strength, he broke free and lunged for the machine, smashing it with the butt of his flashlight. The room erupted in chaos. The loom splintered, the threads snapping like live wires. The tapestry began to unravel, the faces dissolving into mist. The Night Weaver let out a scream, their form flickering before vanishing into the shadows. When the dust settled, the factory was silent. The loom was destroyed, and the tapestry was gone. Is it over? Julia asked, her voice shaking. Elias looked around, his chest heaving. "For now," he said. "But something tells me this isn't the end." As they left the factory, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of the night weaver's web. And deep down, he knew the threads would pull them back in. Chapter 4: Whispers in the Web. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the small diner where Elias and Julia sat today. The factory's destruction had left them both physically and emotionally drained, but the questions surrounding the night weaver still loomed like a dark cloud. Julia stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her gaze distant. "The loom's gone," she said, almost to herself. "But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. The night weaver didn't disappear for good, did they?" Elias rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into his face. "No. I don't think so either. Destroying the loom stopped whatever they were weaving, but it didn't stop them. There's more to this than we understand." Julia leaned forward, her voice lowering. "We need to figure out what they want, Elias. Why those specific people? Why that factory? And why are they so fixated on you?" Elias's jaw tightened. He had been asking himself the same question ever since the night weaver had called him the final thread. The investigation shifted focus over the following days. Julia pored through historical records while Elias interviewed more families of the missing. Patterns began to emerge, threads that tied the victims together. One evening, Julia called Elias to the station with a breakthrough. She had uncovered something buried deep in the town's archives, a diary belonging to Harold Merrick, the factory's founder. The worn leather-bound book was splayed open on Julia's desk, the pages filled with scrawled handwriting. "I found this in the Historical Society's records," she explained. "It's Merrick's journal from the year before his death." Elias flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the cryptic entries. Most were ramblings about weaving and perfection, but one passage caught his attention. "The loom sings to me now. It whispers secrets of the web, of connections that bind us all. The threads are alive, and they demand a design. They say the tapestry will bring harmony, but at what cost? My family does not understand. They fear what I am creating. Perhaps they are right to be afraid." Elias frowned. He thought the loom was alive, that it spoke to him. Julia nodded. And that he was weaving something to fulfill its demands. Whatever the night weaver is, it might be tied to this something Harold Merrick unleashed long ago. Elias closed the diary. The tapestry wasn't just fabric. It was alive. A design with a purpose. But what kind of purpose requires taking people? That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The cryptic words in the diary gnawed at him, their meaning just out of reach. He sat in his dark apartment, staring at the piece of fabric from Jessica Harper's bed. It shimmered faintly in the moonlight, as if responding to his presence. The room felt colder suddenly, and a faint whispering sound filled the air. Elias stiffened, his instincts on high alert. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Detective." The voice was soft, almost melodic. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Elias gripped his sidearm, his pulse racing. "Who's there?" "You cannot escape the web," the voice whispered. "The design is incomplete. The threads must be woven." Elias's chest tightened as a shadowy figure emerged in the corner of the room. The night weaver. Their form was indistinct, cloaked in darkness, yet their presence was suffocating. "What do you want from me?" Elias demanded, his voice trembling. "You are the anchor," the night weaver said. "The thread that holds the design together. Without you, the tapestry will unravel." Elias raised his gun, aiming directly at the figure. "Stay back." The night weaver didn't flinch. You cannot stop what has already begun. The loom was merely a tool. The design continues, detective. And you are part of it. Before Elias could react, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving the room in an eerie silence. The next morning, Elias called Julia, his voice taut with urgency. They came to me, he said. Julia didn't need to ask who. What happened? They called me the anchor, Elias explained. Said the design isn't finished. I think destroying the loom only delayed them. They're still out there, still weaving. And somehow, I'm at the center of it. Julia's voice hardened. Then we need to dig deeper. There has to be something we're missing. They decided to revisit Merrick Mills one last time, hoping to find clues in the ruins of the destroyed loom. The factory was even more foreboding in the daylight, its charred remains standing as a testament to the horrors it had housed. As they searched, Julia found a hidden compartment in the wall near the loom's former location. Inside was a bundle of old documents and blueprints. These look like plans for the loom, she said, spreading them out on the floor. Elias studied the blueprints, his brow furrowing. The loom wasn't just a machine, it was a gateway. The intricate design incorporated symbols and runes that he recognized from Merrick's diary. It's not just weaving fabric, Elias said. It's weaving reality. A bridge between our world and something else. Julia's face paled. What kind of something else? Before Elias could answer, a faint hum filled the air. The threads of the loom, broken and scattered, began to stir. They slithered across the floor like living things, converging at the center of the room. Elias and Julia stepped back as the threads twisted together, forming a crude shape, a figure made entirely of shadow and thread. The night weaver's voice resonated through the factory. You cannot sever the web, detective. The design must be completed. Elias grabbed Julia's arm. We need to get out of here. Now. The threads lunged toward them, but Elias fired his weapon, the bullets tearing through the shadowy figure. It recoiled, buying them enough time to escape the factory. Back at the station, Elias and Julia regrouped. It's not just about the loom or the factory, Elias said. The night weaver is tied to something much bigger, something ancient. If we're going to stop them, we need to understand the design. What they're trying to create. Julia nodded. We'll figure it out. But we're running out of time, Elias. Whatever they're weaving, it's almost done. Elias stared at the shimmering fabric on his desk, a sinking feeling in his chest. The threads of the mystery were pulling tighter, and he was at the center of it all. The night weaver's words echoed in his mind. You are the anchor. Chapter 5. Patterns in the shadows. Elias sat at his desk, staring at the fabric that seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the station. The events at Merrick Mills still played in his mind like a broken record, the threads coming to life, the night weaver's ominous words, and the creeping realization that this wasn't just about disappearances or ancient machines. It was about reality itself, a design beyond human comprehension. Julia entered the room carrying a stack of old files. I think I found something, she said, dropping the papers onto the desk. The Merrick family had a history of strange practices. Rituals, symbols, even talks of binding threads of fate. These aren't just stories, they're part of the family legacy. Elias looked up, his exhaustion giving way to curiosity. Rituals? What kind of rituals? Julia flipped through one of the files, revealing faded sketches and handwritten notes. This symbol here, she pointed, it matches the carvings we saw on the loom's blueprints. It's an ancient rune associated with binding energy, connecting the physical and the metaphysical. Harold Merrick wasn't just weaving fabric, he was weaving reality. Elias leaned forward, studying the symbol. It was intricate, a web-like design that seemed to spiral endlessly. So the loom was, what? A tool for tapping into something bigger? Julia nodded. Exactly. And I think the Night Weaver is trying to finish what Harold started. But there's more. She handed Elias another page, this one detailing accounts from locals in the late 1800s. There were disappearances back then, too. People vanishing without a trace, only for strange fabrics to appear in their homes afterward. It's the same pattern we're seeing now. Elias's grip on the paper tightened. This has been happening for over a century, and no one stopped it. Julia shook her head. No one understood it. But here's the twist: Harold Merrick's family was among the first victims. His wife and 2 children disappeared shortly before he completed the loom. The connection to Harold Merrick's past only deepened the mystery. Elias and Julia decided to visit the Merrick family cemetery, hoping to find more clues. It was a desolate place on the outskirts of town, overgrown with weeds and hidden beneath a canopy of gnarled trees. They moved through the rows of weathered gravestones until they found Harold Merrick's. The headstone was simple, inscribed with his name and a date of death. But something else caught Elias's eye, a carving at the base of the stone. It's the same rune, he said, kneeling to get a closer look. Julia crouched beside him. Why would he carve this on his own grave? Elias traced the symbol with his fingers, feeling the grooves in the stone. Maybe he thought it would protect him. Or maybe it's a marker for something. He stood and began searching the ground around the grave, brushing away leaves and dirt. His instincts paid off when his hand struck something metallic, a rusted latch. Julia, help me with this. Together, they pried open a hidden compartment beneath the grave. Inside was a small, weathered chest. Elias lifted it carefully and opened the lid. The contents were a mix of papers, a small journal, and a bundle of fabric that looked eerily similar to the one Elias had found in Jessica Harper's home. Julia opened the journal, flipping through the fragile pages. It's Harold's writing, she said. He talks about the loom, the voices, and the design. He believed the loom was speaking to him, showing him how to create something eternal. Something that could bind all of humanity together. Elias frowned. Bind them how? What does that mean? Julia's voice dropped. It means control, Elias. The loom wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon. And Harold Merrick was trying to wield it. Back at the station, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Harold Merrick had unleashed something through his loom, something that had lingered long after his death. The Night Weaver wasn't just continuing his work, they were perfecting it. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his role in this. The Night Weaver had called him the anchor, and the words echoed in his mind. That night, as Elias tried to piece together the connections, a knock at his door startled him. He opened it to find an elderly woman standing there, her eyes clouded with fear. Detective Quinn, she asked, her voice trembling. Yes. Can I help you? The woman clutched a piece of fabric in her hands, similar to the one Elias had found before. I think you need to see this. Elias invited her inside and sat her down. She introduced herself as Margaret Gibbons, a lifelong resident of the town. I don't know how to explain this, Margaret began, but I've seen this fabric before. My grandmother had it when I was a little girl. She said it came from Harold Merrick's factory, but she wouldn't say how she got it. She called it cursed. Elias took the fabric from her, examining it closely. Cursed how? Margaret hesitated, her hands trembling. She said it showed her things, visions of people she knew, but they weren't right. It was like they were trapped in the threads, screaming silently. Elias's stomach turned. Did she ever say what happened to it? Margaret nodded. She tried to burn it, but it wouldn't burn. Eventually, she buried it in the woods, hoping to be rid of it. But now, she gestured to the fabric in Elias's hand. It's back. And it's worse than ever. After Margaret left, Elias sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The fabric wasn't just a clue, it was a piece of the design, something that connected the victims, the loom, and the night weaver. The threads were tightening, and Elias could feel himself being pulled deeper into the web. Whatever the night weaver was planning, it was nearing completion. He looked at the fabric one last time before locking it away in a drawer. As he did, he made a silent vow: he would unravel the night weaver's design, no matter the cost. Chapter 6: The Loom of Lost Souls. Elias had spent the night poring over the journal and the fragments of evidence he'd collected. Harold Merrick's cryptic notes spoke of binding threads and woven souls, but they offered no concrete answers, only an unrelenting sense of dread. Every lead seemed to circle back to the loom itself, an ancient machine capable of unimaginable horrors. Morning brought no relief, only a renewed urgency as Elias met Julia at the station. The weight of the recent discoveries hung heavy in the air. We need to go back to Merrick Mills, Elias said. The answers are there, I'm sure of it. Julia hesitated. Elias, you barely made it out alive the last time. Whatever that place is, it's not normal. If we go back, we need a plan. Elias nodded. Agreed. We're not just going in blind this time. I want to examine every inch of that loom, and I want to know how it works. Julia sighed, gathering her things. Then we'd better be prepared for whatever we find. If the night weaver's behind this, they won't let us poke around without a fight. The journey to Merrick Mills felt longer than before, the landscape shrouded in an eerie quiet. The dilapidated factory loomed in the distance, its broken windows resembling hollow eyes. Inside, the oppressive atmosphere was the same. Dust motes floated in the stale air, and the faint scent of oil and decay lingered. The loom sat at the center of the factory floor, its presence commanding and malevolent. Elias and Julia approached cautiously. This time, Elias brought tools, bolt cutters, flashlights, and a camera to document everything. Start with the base, he instructed Julia. I'll check the control panel. As Julia crouched to examine the base of the loom, Elias focused on the strange dials and switches on the panel. It looked like no machine he'd ever seen, its mechanisms a bizarre fusion of industrial engineering and something otherworldly. What do you think this does? Julia asked, holding up a lever that had been hidden beneath the base. Elias studied it. Looks like a tension regulator, but it's not connected to anything mechanical. Try pulling it. Julia hesitated before giving the lever a gentle tug. Instantly, the loom whirred to life, its gears grinding and threads snapping taut. Turn it off. Elias shouted, but Julia froze, transfixed by the patterns forming in the fabric. The threads glowed faintly as they wove together, creating images that flickered and shifted. Elias grabbed Julia's arm and pulled her back. What are you doing? He demanded. Julia blinked, as if waking from a trance. I saw something in the threads. Faces, Elias. People's faces. Elias turned back to the loom, his pulse quickening. The fabric now displayed a swirling tapestry of human faces, their expressions frozen in silent agony. Those are the victims, he muttered. They're trapped in the fabric. Julia covered her mouth, her voice trembling. Elias, if that's true, then this machine isn't just weaving cloth. It's weaving people's souls. The realization hit them both like a tidal wave. The loom wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a conduit, a tool for harvesting human essence and binding it into its designs. Elias stepped closer, examining the fabric more closely. Each thread seemed to pulse with a faint light, as if alive. He reached out to touch it, but Julia grabbed his wrist. "Don't," she warned. "We don't know what it'll do to you." He nodded, withdrawing his hand. "We need to find a way to shut this thing down. Permanently." Julia gestured to Harold Merrick's journal. "There might be something in here." He mentioned a failsafe, but the notes are fragmented. Elias flipped through the pages, scanning for anything that could help. One entry caught his attention: "The design is incomplete. Without the anchor, the threads will unravel, and the loom will collapse into itself. But the anchor must remain intact, or the design will consume everything." "The anchor," Elias said aloud. "The night weaver called me that." Julia frowned. "Why would they call you that? What does it mean?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. "But if I'm the anchor, maybe I'm the key to stopping this." Julia grabbed his arm, her voice urgent. "Elias, think about what you're saying. If you're the anchor, and you remove yourself from the equation, what happens to you?" Elias met her gaze, his expression grim. "I don't care. If it means stopping this thing, it's worth it." Before they could debate further, the sound of footsteps echoed through the factory. Elias and Julia turned toward the entrance, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, the night weaver. Their presence was as unsettling as ever, their face obscured by the same flowing fabric mask. The air around them seemed to ripple, as if reality itself bent to their will. "You've come far, Detective Quinn," the night weaver said, their voice a chilling blend of male and female tones. "But you've only seen the edges of the design. Step closer, and I'll show you the full tapestry." Elias squared his shoulders, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered weapon. "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" The night weaver tilted their head. "What I want is irrelevant. What matters is the design. It must be completed, and you, detective, are the final thread." Elias pulled his gun and aimed it at the figure. "Stay back." The night weaver didn't flinch. Instead, they raised their hands, and the threads from the loom sprang to life, snaking through the air toward Elias and Julia. "Run!" Elias shouted, firing a shot at the figure. The bullet passed through them as if they were made of smoke. Julia grabbed his arm, and they sprinted toward the exit. The threads pursued them, slashing through the air like living whips. They barely made it out of the factory, slamming the heavy doors shut behind them. Outside, they leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. "We can't keep running," Elias said. "We have to face this head-on." Julia nodded, her expression determined. "Then we need a plan. If you're the anchor, we need to figure out how to break their hold on you without destroying everything." Elias looked back at the factory, its dark silhouette looming against the sky. The night weaver's words echoed in his mind: "You are the final thread." The threads were tightening, and Elias knew the time for answers was running out. Chapter 7: Entangled in Shadows. The silence outside Merrick Mills was suffocating, as though the air itself conspired to keep Elias and Julia from catching their breath. The factory loomed behind them, its ominous presence an unrelenting reminder of the horrors they had uncovered. Elias gripped Julia's arm as they moved toward his car, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. "We have to regroup," Elias said, his voice sharp with urgency. "The night weaver's power isn't just tied to the loom, it's tied to me. If we don't figure this out soon, more people will disappear." Julia nodded, pulling Harold Merrick's journal from her bag. "This journal has to hold the key. We're missing something, but I don't think we can figure it out alone." As they sped away from the factory, Julia flipped through the journal, her fingers trembling. The notes were chaotic. Harold Merrick's writing shifted between meticulous diagrams and manic scrawls, as if his mind had unraveled as he worked. One particular page caught her attention. She traced her finger along a sketch of the loom and the cryptic caption beneath it, "The weaver's anchor binds the loom. To sever the thread is to unravel the design." "What does it mean by severing the thread?" Julia asked, glancing at Elias. Elias kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. "I don't know. But I'm starting to think the anchor isn't just a metaphor, it's literal. If the loom is feeding on me, then breaking that connection might be the only way to stop it. And how do we break it?" Julia pressed. Elias exhaled sharply. "That's the part one don't know." Back at Elias's apartment, they laid out the evidence they had collected, photographs of the loom, pages from Harold Merrick's journal, and the fabric samples that pulsed faintly with trapped souls. Julia brewed coffee, her hands shaking as she poured. "I keep thinking about what the night weaver said," Elias murmured, staring at the threads. "You are the final thread. If they're weaving something, I'm part of the design. The question is, why?" Julia set down her mug and leaned over the table. "What if it's not just you? What if the people who disappeared were also part of this tapestry?" She pointed to the journal. "Look here, Merrick mentions something about patterns in the victims' lives. It's scattered, but it's there. What if the loom doesn't just choose at random?" Elias frowned. "Patterns like what?" "Like connections," Julia said. "Victims who knew each other, or whose lives intersected in some way. Maybe the loom is weaving those connections into something bigger." Elias's mind raced. He thought of the victims, neighbors, co-workers, strangers, and the strange feeling he'd had ever since the case began, as if he were being pulled toward something inevitable. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then the night weaver has been building this tapestry for years, maybe even decades. And I'm the last piece they need to finish it." Julia's eyes widened. "If you're the last piece, then stopping them means unraveling the entire design. But how?" Elias stared at the threads on the table, their faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat. "We go back. We confront the night weaver, and we destroy that loom no matter what it takes." That night, Elias and Julia returned to Merrick Mills armed with a plan. Elias carried a sledgehammer, while Julia brought a bag filled with accelerants and matches. If they couldn't sever the loom's connection to Elias, they would destroy it outright. As they stepped inside the factory, the oppressive atmosphere seemed even heavier than before. The loom sat in the center of the room, its threads glimmering faintly in the darkness. "This place feels alive," Julia whispered, gripping a crowbar. Elias nodded, his grip tightening on the sledgehammer. "Because it is. Let's move." They approached the loom cautiously, the silence broken only by the soft hum of its machinery. Elias raised the sledgehammer, ready to strike, when a voice stopped him cold. "You think brute force will save you, detective?" The night weaver emerged from the shadows, their form shifting and ethereal. Their mask seemed to ripple like fabric in the wind, and the air around them pulsed with an otherworldly energy. "You've come to destroy what you do not understand," the night weaver said, their voice calm yet menacing. "But the design is already in motion. You cannot stop it." Elias squared his shoulders, his heart pounding. "I'll do whatever it takes to stop you. I won't let you take any more lives." The night weaver tilted their head, their tone almost amused. "You misunderstand, detective. I am not taking lives, I am preserving them. The loom weaves their essence into the tapestry, ensuring they are never forgotten." "You're killing people," Julia shouted, stepping forward. Whatever you're doing, it's not preservation, it's murder. The Night Weaver's voice turned cold. Mortal minds cannot comprehend the design. But you, Detective Quinn, are different. You are the anchor, the thread that holds it all together. Without you, the tapestry will collapse, and the souls within will be lost forever. Elias's grip on the sledgehammer tightened. Then let it collapse. I'll take that chance. The Night Weaver raised their hand, and the threads of the loom sprang to life, coiling through the air like serpents. Elias swung the sledgehammer, shattering part of the loom's base, but the threads lashed out, wrapping around his arms and legs. Elias! Julia screamed, rushing forward with the crowbar. She swung it at the threads, but they seemed to absorb the impact, tightening their hold on Elias. Destroy the loom, Elias shouted, struggling against the threads. Don't stop. Julia hesitated, torn between helping Elias and completing their mission. The Night Weaver watched silently, as if daring her to make a choice. Finally, she grabbed the accelerants and began dousing the loom with gasoline. The threads hissed and recoiled, but they didn't let go of Elias. You think fire will stop me, the Night Weaver said, their voice dripping with disdain. The design is eternal. You cannot burn what is already woven. Julia ignored them, striking a match and tossing it onto the loom. Flames erupted, consuming the machine in seconds. The threads writhed and snapped, their hold on Elias weakening. The Night Weaver let out a piercing scream, their form flickering like a dying flame. You will undo everything. Elias broke free, stumbling back as the loom collapsed in a fiery heap. The Night Weaver staggered, their mask disintegrating into ash. The factory began to shake, the walls groaning as the flames spread. Elias, we have to go. Julia shouted, grabbing his arm. They ran, the sound of the collapsing factory echoing behind them. As they reached the outside, the building imploded, sending a plume of smoke and ash into the night sky. Elias and Julia stood in silence, watching the flames consume Merrick Mills. Is it over? Julia asked, her voice barely audible. Elias stared at the smoldering ruins, the Night Weaver's final words echoing in his mind. The design is eternal. He didn't answer. Deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over, not yet. Chapter 8. Whispers of the Unraveled. The fire at Merrick Mills had gutted the building, leaving behind a charred skeleton of steel and ash. Yet, despite the destruction, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly won. The Night Weaver's words echoed in his mind. The design is eternal. For 2 days, the city was eerily quiet. No new disappearances were reported, no strange sightings, and no ominous signs. It was as though the destruction of the loom had halted the Night Weaver's plans. Julia tried to reassure Elias that they had succeeded, but the detective remained unconvinced. In the early hours of the third morning, Elias awoke in a cold sweat. He sat up abruptly, his heart pounding as if he'd just run a marathon. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside his window. He couldn't recall what had startled him awake, but the unease was palpable. Then he saw it. A faint thread, almost imperceptible, stretched from the corner of his bedroom to the edge of his bed. It shimmered faintly in the darkness, pulsing like a living thing. Elias reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against it. The thread quivered, and a flood of images overwhelmed him, faces of the missing, their expressions frozen in fear, the loom spinning endlessly, and the Night Weaver's masked figure, standing in the shadows. Elias jerked his hand back, the images vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The thread dissolved into nothingness, leaving him alone in the silence. He grabbed his phone and called Julia. Elias? Julia's groggy voice answered after a few rings. It's 4 in the morning. What's going on? They're not gone, Elias said, his voice tight. The night weaver. The loom. It's still here, Julia. I just saw it. What do you mean you saw it? She asked, her tone sharpening. There was a thread right in my room. When I touched it, I saw everything. The loom, the missing people, the night weaver. It's like they're still connected to me somehow. Julia was silent for a moment. Elias, the loom was destroyed. We saw it burn. Maybe this is just, it's not in my head. Elias snapped, then sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Sorry. I know what I saw. Something's still out there, and we need to figure out what it is before it's too late. Later that morning, Elias and Julia met at the precinct. Julia had brought Harold Merrick's journal, as well as the few remaining fabric samples they had recovered from the factory. The threads no longer pulsed with the faint glow of trapped souls, but their presence was unsettling nonetheless. Elias spread out the evidence on the table, his eyes scanning the journal's cryptic notes. Merrick mentioned that the loom wasn't just a machine, it was a conduit. If that's true, then destroying it might not have been enough to sever the connection completely. Julia frowned. A conduit to what? The souls. The night weaver. Both, Elias said. But what if there's another loom? Or some other way they're continuing the work? The night weaver called me the anchor. If I'm still alive, then maybe the design is still intact. Julia flipped through the journal, stopping at a page with a rough sketch of the loom and an intricate pattern of threads extending outward. Here, this looks like some kind of diagram. The threads branch out like a web, but they all lead back to a central point. Elias leaned in, studying the drawing. If this is accurate, then there's more than one connection. The loom was just one part of a larger network. Julia's face paled. You're saying there could be more looms? More places like Merrick Mills? Maybe, Elias said grimly. Or maybe the loom wasn't destroyed completely. Either way, we need to find out where these threads lead. Their search led them to the city archives, where they pored over records of old textile factories, abandoned warehouses, and other industrial sites. Julia cross-referenced the locations with the disappearance reports, looking for any patterns. This one, Julia said, pointing to a map. It's an old storage facility on the edge of town. It shut down decades ago, but it's near the neighborhood where two of the victims disappeared. Elias nodded. It's worth checking out. Let's go. The storage facility was a crumbling relic of the past, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows shattered. Elias and Julia approached cautiously, flashlights in hand. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of mildew. As they moved deeper into the building, they noticed faint markings on the walls, symbols similar to those they had seen in Merrick's journal. This place gives me the creeps, Julia muttered, her voice echoing slightly. Elias shone his flashlight ahead, revealing a large metal door at the end of the hallway. Looks like we've found something. They pushed the door open, revealing a cavernous room that was almost completely dark. At the center of the room stood another loom, smaller than the one at Merrick Mills but eerily similar. Threads stretched outward from it, disappearing into the shadows. Another loom, Julia whispered. Elias's chest tightened. The sight of the loom filled him with dread, but also a strange sense of familiarity. It was as if the threads were calling to him before they could move closer. A voice echoed through the room. You should not have come here. The night weaver stepped into the light, their mask glinting faintly. Though their forms seemed more translucent than before, their presence was no less terrifying. I warned you, detective, the night weaver said, their tone cold and detached. The design cannot be undone. Elias stepped forward, his flashlight trained on the figure. The loom at Merrick Mills is gone. You're weaker now. Whatever you're trying to do, it ends here. The Night Weaver laughed, the sound chilling. You think you have the power to stop me? The design is already complete. You are merely witnessing its final threads. As the Night Weaver raised their hand, the threads of the loom began to glow, weaving themselves into intricate patterns in the air. The room seemed to shift around them, the walls dissolving into a swirling void. Julia grabbed Elias's arm. What's happening? I don't know, Elias said, his voice tense. But we're not leaving until we destroy that thing. The Night Weaver advanced, their form shifting and flickering like a shadow caught in a storm. Elias and Julia braced themselves, knowing this was only the beginning of the battle. Chapter 9: The Unraveling Threads. The room pulsed with a strange energy, the loom at its center spinning as though alive, its threads glowing and stretching like veins of light. Elias could feel the weight of the air, thick with anticipation, as if the very fabric of reality was being rewritten around him. The Night Weaver stood before them, their figure barely holding together, flickering like a mirage. Elias clenched his fists, heart pounding. The Night Weaver's words echoed in his mind, "You are merely witnessing its final threads." What did they mean by that? Was it a warning or a taunt? Julia's voice broke through the haze of uncertainty. Elias, we need to destroy it. Whatever this is, it's not just a machine. It's something worse. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the loom. The threads seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. The closer he got, the more the room seemed to warp around him, as though the loom was not just spinning fabric but reshaping reality itself. Don't you see? The Night Weaver's voice echoed, low and menacing. This is the end. The design cannot be undone. Elias glanced at Julia, his voice barely a whisper. We have to find a way to break it. If it's like the first loom, maybe there's a way to destroy it from the inside. Julia's eyes darted to the loom, her brow furrowing. It's not like the first one, Elias. This one feels different. More solid, somehow. Like it's connected to something bigger. The Night Weaver took a step forward, their form flickering more violently. You're too late, detective. The threads are already in place. You cannot stop what is already set in motion. Suddenly, the threads of the loom began to twitch and writhe like serpents, snapping through the air with incredible speed. Elias instinctively lunged forward, but before he could react, the threads lashed out, catching him by the wrist. The force of the pull was enough to send him crashing to the floor, his arm numb with pain. Elias! Julia cried, rushing to his side. She tried to pull him free, but the threads only tightened, constricting around him like a vice. The Night Weaver stepped closer, their masked face almost mocking. You cannot fight the design. It is inevitable. The loom has already chosen its path. Elias struggled against the tightening threads, his breath shallow. The loom's glow seemed to burn brighter, and the world around him began to fracture. He could see flashes of faces, people he hadn't seen in days, weeks, even blurred figures trapped in the web of light that surrounded him. And then, amidst the chaos, a memory surfaced. A conversation from days ago, in the wreckage of Merrick Mills, when he and Julia had first confronted the truth about the loom. The loom wasn't just a tool, it was a vessel, an anchor that held the threads of fate in place. And if the loom fell, so would the web it held together. Elias's heart skipped a beat. The threads weren't just symbols of death, they were threads of reality itself, the connections that bound the world together. If the loom was destroyed, it would unravel the very fabric of existence. No, Elias gasped, his voice strained. The loom isn't just about trapping souls. It's about controlling reality. It's a conduit. The Night Weaver's eyes flickered beneath the mask, a hint of something, satisfaction, flashing in the darkness. Finally, you understand. The loom is the framework, detective. The pattern. The plan. And now, you are part of it. Elias's mind raced. He had been so focused on stopping the Night Weaver that he hadn't realized the true nature of the threat. Destroying the loom wasn't just about saving the missing, it was about saving the world itself. He turned to Julia, his eyes wide with urgency. We can't destroy it. If we do, we're all doomed. But we can't just let it keep going either. Julia shot back, her voice frantic. If we don't stop this, it'll keep going until it consumes everything. The loom's glow grew stronger, its threads tightening around Elias and Julia like the very hand of fate. It was a trap, one designed to pull them deeper into its web. Elias knew they couldn't fight it head-on. Not now. He looked at the Night Weaver, his voice low but determined. You're wrong. The design may be real, but it's not finished. There's still a chance to break it if we can find the right thread. The Night Weaver's laugh was cold, almost bitter. You think you can find the thread? It's all connected. Every piece, every person, every moment. You are as much a part of it as the others. Elias swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of the loom's influence pressing down on him. But he wasn't alone. Julia was by his side, her resolve just as strong. Together, they had to find a way to sever the connection. With a sharp breath, Elias closed his eyes, focusing on the loom's threads. He could feel them now, not just in the room, but all around him, like an invisible web stretching through his mind. And then, amidst the tangled chaos, he found it. A single thread, glowing faintly but separate from the others. It was the thread that connected him, the anchor. Julia, Elias said urgently. I've found it. The thread that holds me here. If we can cut it, we can stop this. She hesitated, looking between him and the loom. But cutting it, it could mean, do it. Elias's voice was firm. We don't have a choice. Julia nodded, her face hardening with determination. She grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the floor, using it to slice through the glowing thread. For a moment, nothing happened. The loom continued to hum, the threads still pulsing with energy. But then, the entire room seemed to shudder. The threads began to unravel, one by one, disintegrating into nothingness. The Night Weaver's figure flickered, their mask cracking, revealing only darkness behind it. You can't. The words were lost as the loom collapsed, its threads scattering into the air like dust. The world around Elias and Julia began to return to normal, the oppressive weight lifting from their shoulders. The Night Weaver's figure dissolved entirely, leaving only an empty space. For a moment, Elias and Julia stood in the aftermath, their breaths ragged, hearts still racing. The loom was gone. The web of fate had been severed. But the question remained, had they truly stopped the Night Weaver, or had they simply delayed something far darker? Chapter 10, Echoes of the Loom. The silence that followed the destruction of the loom was heavy, like the calm after a storm. Elias stood in the center of the darkened room, his mind reeling from the events that had just transpired. The loom, once a looming and malevolent force, was now nothing but scattered threads, shattered remnants of a nightmare that had been far too real. Yet, as the weight of their actions settled on him, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. The Night Weaver had vanished, but the repercussions of their actions were far from clear. Julia's voice broke through his thoughts. Elias, we need to leave. This place, it's not safe anymore. Her voice was strained, as though she, too, could feel the lingering sense of danger that clung to the air. He turned to her, his gaze conflicted. But what happens now? We've destroyed the loom, but what if that wasn't the only one? What if there are others? Julia shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. We don't know. But we can't stay here, not like this. If the Night Weaver was right, then the loom's influence may still be out there. But we can't fix everything by standing still. Elias swallowed hard, his heart heavy. He had thought they were close to ending this nightmare. But now, standing in the ruins of the loom, he realized that the Night Weaver's cryptic words about threads and fate had been more than just a warning. They had been a truth, one that Elias wasn't ready to face. Still, Julia was right. They had to move forward. And, as much as it terrified him, Elias knew the next step was to confront whatever awaited them beyond the loom's destruction. The city felt different as they stepped back into the streets. The air was thick, as though it, too, had been altered by the events inside the warehouse. The buildings loomed taller than usual, their edges sharper, more oppressive. Even the light from the street lamps seemed to pulse with a strange energy, casting long shadows that flickered as if alive. Where do we even start? Julia asked, glancing at him. We don't know if the loom was the source of everything, or if there's something else we're missing. Elias paused, his thoughts racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface. The loom had been a tool, a means to an end. But the force behind it, the Night Weaver, had been something far more elusive. And even though they had destroyed the loom, Elias had a sinking suspicion that it had only been a small part of a much larger puzzle. There's someone we need to talk to, Elias said, his voice firm. Someone who might know more about the loom, and who could help us understand what we're dealing with. Julia raised an eyebrow. And who might that be? Elias hesitated. He had been reluctant to involve anyone else, but now, it seemed there was no other choice. Dr. Leland Crawford. He was one of the original researchers who worked on the project. He may have answers. Dr. Crawford's office was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, far from the chaos of the events they had left behind. The building was old, its brick walls crumbling and covered in ivy, yet it had an air of quiet dignity. Inside, the dim lighting and worn leather furniture made it feel more like a place for reflection than research. Dr. Leland Crawford himself was an older man, his face lined with years of experience and a heavy burden of knowledge. He wore glasses that seemed perpetually perched on the edge of his nose, and his suit, though outdated, exuded a quiet professionalism. Elias and Julia stepped into his office, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to hang in the air. Detective Sinclair, Dr. Crawford said, his voice a low murmur as he adjusted his glasses. I was wondering when you'd come. Elias didn't waste time with pleasantries. You knew about the loom, didn't you? He asked, his voice sharp. You were involved in its creation. And now, it's destroyed. But the Night Weaver, what do you know about them? Crawford's eyes flickered with something, fear, perhaps, or regret. He took a seat behind his desk, motioning for Elias and Julia to do the same. I was part of the original team, Crawford admitted, his voice tinged with guilt. But it wasn't as simple as just creating a machine. The loom was a project born out of something far darker. We weren't just looking for a way to control fate or manipulate reality. The loom was meant to anchor something much older and more powerful. Julia leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. Something older? What do you mean? Dr. Crawford's face tightened. I should never have been involved in that project. But I thought we were creating something that could help, something that could bring order to chaos. But we were wrong. The loom wasn't just a machine. It was a conduit to something far beyond our understanding. Something ancient. Elias's mind raced. What are you saying? That the loom connected us to some kind of otherworldly force? Dr. Crawford nodded slowly. Exactly. The loom was built to channel energies from another realm, a place beyond the boundaries of our reality. It's not just a machine that we built, it's a doorway. And the Night Weaver, they were the one who had control of it. Julia's expression darkened. So the Night Weaver wasn't just manipulating people, they were controlling the loom. Using it to warp reality itself. Yes, Crawford said, his voice tight. But you've destroyed the loom. And that's where things get complicated. The energy that the loom was channeling is still out there. And now, without the loom to anchor it, it could break through. The Night Weaver was merely a gatekeeper. But with the loom gone, the gate is wide open. Elias felt the ground shift beneath him. What does that mean for us? For everyone? It means, Dr. Crawford said softly, that the destruction of the loom may have started a chain reaction. The threads, the connections to other realities, are unraveling. And soon, it won't just be the loom that's in danger. It'll be everything. The fabric of reality itself is coming apart. Elias felt a chill creep down his spine. They had destroyed the loom, but they had unknowingly opened a door to something far worse. And now, they were racing against time to stop a collapse that had been set in motion long before they ever arrived. We need to find the Night Weaver, Elias said, his voice hard with resolve. They're the only ones who can stop this. Dr. Crawford's eyes darkened. Be careful, detective. The Night Weaver was never human to begin with. And now that the loom is gone, they may not be the only threat you face. As Elias and Julia left Dr. Crawford's office, the weight of their new reality settled over them. The loom had been destroyed, yes, but that was only the beginning. The threads of fate, reality, and something far darker were unraveling, and with it, the Night Weaver's grip on the world was slipping. But what awaited them next? Elias wasn't sure. All he knew was that the final threads had yet to be pulled, and until they found the truth behind the loom, they were all still trapped in its web. Chapter 11. The Fractured Path. The city had changed since Elias and Julia destroyed the loom. Where once there had been a subtle unease, now there was an undeniable tension in the air. The streets felt unfamiliar, as though the very fabric of the world around them was unraveling. Every corner they turned seemed slightly askew, the shadows deeper, the lights dimmer. Elias felt like he was walking in a dream, where nothing was quite as it seemed. The warning Dr. Crawford had given them echoed in his mind. The destruction of the loom had opened a door, and the consequences were far from over. The Night Weaver was not the only threat they had to face now. Something more dangerous was coming, a force that had been lying dormant, waiting for this very moment. As they moved through the city, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he saw nothing but empty streets, yet the sensation lingered. Julia seemed to sense it too. She was tense, her hand always hovering near the gun at her side, her eyes scanning the shadows. We're getting closer, Elias said, his voice low. I can feel it. Julia nodded, her expression tight. Closer to what? Closer to the Night Weaver, Elias replied, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the street ahead. I think they're trying to guide us somewhere. Julia frowned. Guide us? We've been tracking them this whole time, and they've been leading us in circles. I don't think it's been a circle, Elias said slowly. I think it's a web. And we're in the center of it now. The threads we've been following are connecting us to something much bigger. The Night Weaver is trying to manipulate us, to lead us towards something, or someone. Julia's expression darkened. What do you mean? If they've been controlling the loom, then they must have known we were coming. They must have known we'd destroy it. That's what doesn't make sense, Elias muttered. Why would they let us destroy it? Why wouldn't they have stopped us? The answer came to him slowly, like a creeping realization. The Night Weaver had never been interested in the loom itself. The loom was a means to an end, a tool to control reality, yes, but only a tool. The true power, the true danger, lay in what had been released when they destroyed it. We've been going about this all wrong, Elias said, his voice rising with a sudden clarity. The Night Weaver isn't just trying to manipulate us, they're trying to bring something through. Something that was sealed away. The loom wasn't the source of power. It was the anchor. And now that it's gone, the world is vulnerable. Julia's eyes widened. Are you saying that the Night Weaver wasn't the endgame? That they were just a part of something worse? Elias nodded, his jaw set in grim determination. Yes. The Night Weaver was just a guardian, a keeper of the doorway. Now, with the loom destroyed, the doorway is wide open. They continued through the streets, a sense of urgency pressing on them. The city, once familiar, now felt like an alien landscape, each building twisted and distorted as if reality itself had been warped. And as they moved deeper into the heart of the city, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't long before they arrived at an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, a place they had passed countless times before, but never paid attention to. Now, however, something about it felt important. The building stood like a silent sentinel, its windows shattered and its door hanging off its hinges. Elias could feel the pull in his chest, the irresistible draw to enter. This is it, he said, his voice steady despite the unease clawing at him. The Night Weaver is here. Julia's hand hovered over her gun. We don't know what we're walking into. I know, Elias said. But it's the only place left. Together, they stepped into the building, the air thick with dust and the remnants of something long forgotten. The floor creaked beneath their feet, the echoes of their steps stretching out into the empty space. The walls were covered in strange symbols, markings that seemed to shift and change as they moved closer, like something alive. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as they descended into the depths of the building. The darkness seemed to press in on them, and with every step, the air grew colder, more oppressive. At the very end of the hallway, they found it, an old, iron door, covered in the same symbols that decorated the walls. This is it, Elias whispered. Julia took a deep breath. Do you think this is where the Night Weaver has been hiding? I don't know, Elias said, his hand resting on the cold metal of the door. But whatever's behind it, we need to stop it before it's too late. With a sharp breath, Elias pushed open the door. Inside, the room was unlike anything they had encountered before. It was large and circular, with a high ceiling that seemed to stretch on forever. In the center of the room was an altar, dark and ancient, with chains hanging from the walls. And standing before it, shrouded in shadow, was the Night Weaver. The figure turned slowly, their face hidden beneath a dark, hooded cloak. For a moment, there was silence, an oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow everything around them. Then, the Night Weaver spoke. You've come to finish what you started, they said, their voice a low, haunting whisper. But it's too late. The threads are already unraveling. You cannot stop what has already been set in motion. Elias's pulse quickened. What are you? What have you been trying to do? The Night Weaver stepped forward, their movements fluid and unnatural. I am but a servant, they said, their voice barely a murmur. I've only been keeping the door closed. But now, the time has come for it to open. You destroyed the loom, but that was only the beginning. The threads are broken, and there is nothing you can do to stop what's coming. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. What's coming? The night weaver's eyes, glowing faintly from beneath their hood, pierced through him. The fabric of reality itself is tearing. And when it does, all that was locked away will return. You've seen glimpses of it, detective. The shadows that follow you. The whispers in the dark. They are the remnants of what has been forgotten, and now they will come to reclaim what is theirs. Elias took a step forward, his mind racing. What are we supposed to do? How do we stop it? The night weaver tilted their head, as though considering the question. You can't stop it, they said softly. But you can choose how it ends. Before Elias could respond, the night weaver reached out, their hand brushing the air as if pulling something from the very fabric of reality itself. The room began to warp and distort, the walls twisting, the ground shaking. The door had been opened, and there was no turning back now. Elias and Julia's hearts raced as the room around them fractured, reality itself splintering at the seams. Whatever the night weaver had unleashed, it was beyond anything they had ever imagined. But the choice had been made now, it was up to them to decide how the story would end. Chapter 12. The Final Thread. The world trembled around Elias and Julia as the air in the room warped and twisted, bending to an unseen force. The walls seemed to collapse in on themselves, their shapes becoming indistinct, as if they were mere fragments of a broken reality. The ground beneath their feet shook, and a deep, resonating hum filled the space. The night weaver's shadowed figure stood at the center of it all, motionless and unfazed by the chaos that surrounded them. Elias felt the weight of everything pressing on him. The destruction of the loom, the unraveling threads of reality, the whispers in the dark, they had led him here, to this moment. The truth was clear now. There was no way to undo what had been done. The forces they had disturbed were too powerful, too far-reaching. And yet, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the key to stopping it was right in front of him. What is it that you want? Elias asked, his voice steady despite the growing instability of the world around them. Why have you been hiding all this time? The night weaver's face, still hidden in shadow, tilted slightly as though considering the question. I have not been hiding, they said, their voice a soft echo, like a distant whisper carried by the wind. I have been waiting. Waiting for the right moment to open the door. The door that has remained shut for so long. You, detective, were always part of the plan. Julia took a step forward, her hand on her weapon, but Elias stopped her with a look. He was no longer sure that fighting the night weaver would lead to the resolution they needed. The world was unraveling, but violence had never been the solution to this puzzle. It was something deeper, something they had overlooked in their pursuit of the truth. Why us? Elias pressed. Why let us destroy the loom? The night weaver's cloak shifted, and their voice became more deliberate. The loom was never meant to be destroyed. It was never about the loom itself, but the truth it protected. The loom was a barrier, a containment device that kept the threads of reality intact. You have shattered that barrier. And now there are no limits. The air thickened, the room seemingly stretching into infinity. Elias's mind raced as he realized the magnitude of their actions. By destroying the loom, they had inadvertently ripped open the fabric of reality itself. The night weaver wasn't the enemy, they had merely been a caretaker, holding the doorway closed. Now, the door was wide open. What's behind the door? Julia asked, her voice barely audible against the hum that filled the air. The night weaver's eyes flickered, glowing faintly beneath their hood. Beyond the door lies the truth. The truth that has been buried for centuries. The truth of what came before, And what will come after? The truth of what the world was meant to be. Elias felt a cold chill run through him. The implications were enormous. The truth of what had come before, what was locked away, could destroy everything they knew. And the idea that reality itself had been tampered with, reshaped over millennia, was a truth too vast to comprehend. He turned to Julia, who met his gaze with a mixture of fear and resolve. She had always been the one to follow orders, to protect him when things got too dangerous, but now they were both standing on the edge of the unknown. It wasn't about solving a case anymore. It wasn't about catching the criminal or restoring order. The world, the very foundation of existence, was slipping away. What was left to save? Elias took a deep breath, centering himself. They had come so far. They had witnessed the unraveling of everything they had known. But there was still a choice to be made. If we close the door, Elias said, his voice clear, if we reverse what we've done, what will happen? The night weaver's lips curled into a faint smile, though it was hidden in the darkness. You cannot reverse it. The door cannot be closed once it is opened. But you can decide what happens next. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. What do you mean? The threads of reality are fractured, detective. You cannot put them back together, but you can weave a new thread. A thread of your own making. The question is not how to stop it, but how to move forward. What will you do now that everything you knew has been destroyed? Elias looked down at his hands. There was nothing left to hold on to. No rules, no laws, no guideposts. Only the raw, untempered chaos of an uncertain future. The world was broken, its threads scattered like the remnants of a shattered mirror. And yet, there was a chance to shape something new. He turned to Julia, who stood beside him, her face pale but resolute. We can still make a choice. A final one. To build something new from the destruction. Julia nodded, her eyes steady. If the world is broken, we can rebuild it. But only if we have the strength to face the truth. The night weaver stepped forward, their form dissolving into shadows. The world was never meant to be static. It was always meant to change, to evolve. You have broken the loom, but in doing so, you have opened the possibility of creation. Elias stepped toward the altar, his heart beating with purpose. He reached out and, for the first time, felt the threads that were scattered throughout the room. They were not just fragments of the past, they were possibilities. Choices. He could feel the power of the choices they had made, the lives they had lived, the decisions that had led them to this point. With a single motion, Elias began to weave a new thread. It was fragile, but it was his. It was a thread that carried with it the potential to rebuild, to create something new from the ashes of the old world. As he wove, Julia stepped beside him, her presence a steadying force. Together, they shaped the thread, binding it with purpose, with the will to protect what was left, to preserve the best parts of the world even as the old ways crumbled away. The night weaver watched them silently, their role now complete. The choice had been made, the hum in the room began to fade, and the world outside the building began to quiet. The cracks in the air began to heal, and the shifting, warping shadows receded into the background. Elias and Julia stood together, holding the newly woven thread, watching as it began to glow with the faintest light. You've done it, the night weaver said softly. You've chosen your path. Elias nodded, feeling the weight of the world in his hands, but also the freedom that came with it. The world might never be the same, but it was theirs to shape now. As the night weaver vanished into the shadows, Elias and Julia stood in the silence that followed. The final thread had been woven, and with it, a new world began.